A mountain man joked he'd marry the little beggar girl when she grew up. Years later, he did. Dust swirls down a lonely frontier street. A starving child begs for scraps until a rugged mountain man bends low and makes a promise he never means to keep. But 10 years later, the bell tolls, and the girl is no longer a child. She's a proud school teacher, standing tall against gossip, prejudice, and the weight of her past. The town laughs at the old joke, turning it into scandal. And just when love seems ready to triumph, a drunken father staggers from the shadows, demanding money, demanding control, dragging her name through the dust. Thunder of hooves, whispers in church pews. A vow spoken in jest now collides with a vow before God. Will the mountain man risk his reputation, his home, even his life, to prove that what began as a joke has become the truest promise of all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind howled through the streets of Miller's Creek, whipping snow against the weathered buildings. Emmanuel Harkins hunched deeper into his buffalo coat as he guided his horse down the muddy main street. The settlement had grown some since his last supply run 3 months back. A new roof here, fresh-cut timber there. Not that it meant much to a mountain man like him. The crunch of his boots in the crusty snow echoed off the empty storefronts. Most folks were huddled inside against the bitter cold. Emmanuel preferred it that way. He wasn't much for conversation these days, not since losing Sarah and the baby to fever 5 years ago. The high country suited him better. Just him, his traps, and the quiet mountains. The livery stable offered some shelter from the wind. Emmanuel dismounted stiffly, his joints protesting after the long ride down from his cabin. As he led his horse inside, something moved in the shadows of an empty stall. "Who's there?" he called out, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. A small figure darted out, then froze like a startled rabbit. It was a child. A girl, he reckoned, though it was hard to tell under the layers of ragged clothes. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes were bright and fierce as she stared him down. "Ain't doing no harm," she said, lifting her chin. "Just keeping warm is all." Emmanuel studied her for a moment. She couldn't be more than 9 or 10 years old, far too young to be alone in this weather. Despite her brave words, he could see her shivering. "Where's your folks, girl?" "Ain't got none." She shuffled her feet in the straw. "Ma died last spring. Never knew my pa." Emmanuel grunted softly. He'd seen too many orphans in frontier towns like this. Life was hard out here, and death came easy. Still, something about this one's stubborn pride touched him. "When'd you eat last?" She shrugged, trying to look unconcerned, but her hollow cheeks told their own story. Emmanuel sighed and reached for his coin purse. "Come on then, let's get some food in you." The girl hesitated, suspicious of his offer. "I ain't taking charity." "Ain't charity. Figure you can earn your supper by helping me stable my horse." He gestured to the bay gelding. "Know anything about horses?" A tiny smile flickered across her face. "Some. Used to help at Morton's place before they sold up." "What's your name, girl?" "Kim," she said, already moving to help him unsaddle the horse. Her small hands worked quickly, though they trembled with cold. Emmanuel watched as she helped brush down his mount, noting how she spoke softly to the horse and knew the proper way to check its hooves. She had good instincts, this one. Once the horse was settled, Emmanuel led Kim across to the cafe. The warmth inside hit them like a wall, and Kim's eyes went wide at the smell of cooking. A few heads turned to stare at the odd pair, the gruff mountain man and the ragged child, but Emmanuel ignored them. "2 bowls of stew," he told the waitress, "and some bread if you've got it." Kim perched on the edge of her chair like she might need to bolt at any moment. But when the food arrived, she attacked it with desperate hunger, though she tried to remember her manners. Emmanuel ate more slowly, watching her. There was something about her that reminded him of himself at that age, that determined self-reliance masking deeper hurts. "Reckon you could use a proper place to stay," he said after a while. "Can't have you sleeping in stables." Kim's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "I get by fine." "Maybe so. But winter's setting in hard. Ain't no shame in accepting help when it's offered." She studied him with those sharp eyes. "Why do you care?" Emmanuel considered the question. Truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Maybe because someone helped me once, when I needed it." He leaned back, a faint smile touching his weathered face. "Tell you what, you keep being brave like this. Maybe I'll marry you when you grow up, little beggar girl." It was just a jest, meant to lighten the moment, but something in Kim's expression shifted. For just a second, he glimpsed the lonely child beneath the tough exterior as a real smile bloomed across her face. Emmanuel felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, one that had nothing to do with the hot stew. It had been a long time since he'd made anyone smile like that. After they finished eating, Emmanuel led Kim down the street to the small church where Preacher Wilkes and his wife lived. The preacher's wife, Martha, opened the door at his knock, her kind face creasing with concern when she saw Kim. "Found this one sleeping in the livery," Emmanuel explained. "Thought maybe you might have room for her?" Martha's eyes softened as she looked at Kim. "Of course we do. Come in out of the cold, child." Kim glanced uncertainly between Emmanuel and Martha. "I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," Emmanuel said firmly. He pulled out his coin purse and pressed it into Martha's hands. "This should help some with her keep." Martha tried to protest, but Emmanuel shook his head. "Just see she gets what she needs." He turned to go, but Kim's small voice stopped him. "Will you come back?" Emmanuel looked back at her, standing in the doorway's warm lamplight. That smile of hers had stirred something in him, something he'd thought long buried in the mountain snows. "Maybe I will, little beggar girl. Maybe I will." The wind had died down some as Emmanuel rode back toward the high country. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the winter sky. As his horse picked its way up the familiar trail, Emmanuel found himself thinking about Kim's smile, about the way she'd tried so hard to be brave and strong despite everything. He'd meant that joke about marriage as nothing more than a way to make her laugh. But somehow, the words felt different now, hanging in the cold night air like a promise. Emmanuel shook his head at himself. He was getting soft, letting a little orphan girl affect him this way. Still, as his cabin came into view, dark against the snowy peaks, Emmanuel realized the usual emptiness of coming home alone didn't feel quite so heavy tonight. That unexpected warmth still lingered in his chest, like a small flame pushing back the winter cold. He took care of his horse and went inside, building up the fire and settling into his familiar routine. But as he sat in his chair by the hearth, Emmanuel found himself wondering if Kim was warm enough in her new bed, if she was getting enough to eat. It had been years since he'd worried about anyone but himself. "You're a fool, Emmanuel Harkins," he muttered to the fire. But he couldn't quite stop the smile that tugged at his mouth when he remembered Kim's brave face and fierce eyes. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of more snow. But inside, Emmanuel sat by his fire, the memory of a child's smile warming him more than the flames ever could. The winter sun streamed through the church windows, casting warm squares of light on the wooden floor where Kim knelt beside Martha Wilkes. Her hands were clasped tight, eyes squeezed shut as she concentrated on remembering the words. "Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for these gifts." She stumbled slightly, but Martha's gentle whisper guided her through the rest of the grace. The simple breakfast of porridge and dried apples seemed like a feast to Kim after so many months of scrounging. Even more precious was the routine: regular meals, a warm bed, and people who expected her at their table. "You're learning quick," Martha said, patting Kim's hand. "Both your prayers and your letters. Kim beamed at the praise. Every evening she practiced writing on her slate board until her fingers were chalky and stiff. The letters still looked wobbly, but she could write her own name now. Sometimes she practiced writing Emmanuel too, though she kept that private. A knock at the door interrupted their breakfast. Kim's heart leaped, recognizing the pattern. 3 sharp raps, then a pause, then 2 more. Emmanuel's knock. "Morning, Mrs. Wilkes," he said gruffly when Martha opened the door. He stood awkwardly on the porch, a deer haunch wrapped in burlap under one arm. "Thought you might use some fresh meat." "Why, thank you, Mr. Harkins." "Won't you join us for breakfast?" Emmanuel shifted his weight, boots creaking. "Much obliged, but I best be getting on." His eyes flickered briefly to Kim, then away. "Storm's coming?" "Need to check my trap lines." Kim wanted to run to him, to tell him about learning her letters, but something in his stance kept her in her chair. He always seemed to hold himself apart, like a wild creature that might spook at any sudden movement. Still, he kept coming back. Every few days there would be something, a stack of split firewood by the door, fresh game, or winter apples from his root cellar. He never stayed long, but Kim noticed how his eyes swept over her each time, checking that she was well-fed and properly clothed. After Emmanuel left, Kim helped Martha prepare the venison for cooking. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Burton and Mrs. Peterson walking past, their heads bent together in gossip. "Did you hear about that beggar child the preacher took in?" Mrs. Burton's voice carried clearly. "Telling everyone she's going to marry Emmanuel Harkins of all people, as if that wild man would ever." Kim's cheeks burned, but she kept working, her movements precise and determined as she cut the meat into neat portions, just as Martha had taught her. "Don't let their words trouble you," Martha said softly. "Some folks just can't help being small-minded." "I don't care what they say," Kim replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Emmanuel promised?" Martha gave her a thoughtful look. "Did he now?" "Well," Kim hesitated, "he said maybe he would, when I grow up. And Emmanuel doesn't lie." Martha didn't argue, but her eyes were gentle with concern. "Promises are serious things, child. Best not to pin too many hopes on casual words." But Kim couldn't help it. That moment in the cafe, when Emmanuel had made her laugh for the first time in months, had lit something inside her, a warm certainty that felt like belonging. The townspeople's mockery only made her more determined to prove herself worthy of it. She threw herself into her chores, learning to cook and clean to Martha's exacting standards. She studied her letters until she could read simple passages from the Bible. On Sundays, she wore her best dress, one of Martha's old ones, carefully altered, and sat straight-backed in the church pew, singing the hymns in her clear young voice. Emmanuel came to services sometimes, though he always sat in the back row and slipped out before the final hymn. Kim would feel his presence like warmth on the back of her neck, but she never turned around. She'd learned that trying to pin Emmanuel down was like trying to catch smoke. The harder you grabbed, the quicker it slipped away. Still, she noticed things. How he appeared more often when the weather was harshest, as if checking that the house stayed warm enough. How he seemed to materialize whenever the older boys tried to tease her, his silent presence enough to make them shuffle away. Once, she caught him watching from across the street as she successfully read a whole sentence from her primer to Martha, and the pride in his eyes made her stand taller. The townsfolk noticed too. Their whispers followed Kim everywhere, about her ragged past, about Emmanuel's strange interest in her welfare. Some suggested darkly that no good could come of a wild mountain man paying such attention to a young girl. But Preacher Wilkes shut down the worst of the gossip with stern warnings about bearing false witness. One snowy Sunday in late January, Kim sat in her usual pew, listening to Preacher Wilkes deliver his sermon. The text was about Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, about choosing to belong to someone even when the world thought it strange. Kim felt the words settle in her heart, like seeds. As always, she sensed Emmanuel's presence in the back of the church. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. She'd learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that surrounded him, like the hush before a snowfall. When the final hymn began, she heard the soft creak of his boots on the floorboards. Still, she kept her eyes forward, singing clearly. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! That saved a wretch like me." The door opened and closed quietly. Through the frosted windows, she watched Emmanuel's tall figure move away through the swirling snow, heading back toward his mountain solitude. But Kim wasn't worried. She knew he'd be back, bringing game or firewood or just his watchful presence. That was Emmanuel's way of keeping his maybe promise, not with words or shows of affection, but with the steady persistence of someone who'd chosen to take responsibility for another's welfare. Kim's voice rose stronger on the next verse, carried by that certainty. Let the townsfolk whisper. She knew what she knew, and she could be patient. After all, she had years yet to grow into that promise, and she intended to make herself worthy of it. The hymn swelled around her, warm as a blanket against the winter cold. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Martha's hand squeezed her shoulder gently, and Kim smiled, surrounded by the family she'd found and the promise of the family yet to come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering all the rough places with its soft white grace. The mountain snows began their slow retreat as March yielded to April. Patches of muddy earth emerged between dwindling drifts, and the first brave crocus flowers poked through the thawing ground. Emmanuel tracked these changes from his cabin high in the hills, marking winter's surrender in his trapper's journal with the same care he used to record his pelts and trades. His nights were still solitary, but somehow different now. The silence felt heavier, more noticeable. Sometimes he caught himself wondering if Kim had enough warm clothes for the lingering cold, or if she was keeping up with her studies. Such thoughts usually sent him reaching for his coat, checking his stores for extra meat or produce he could spare. The midnight deliveries became a habit. Emmanuel would ride into town when the streets were empty, his horse's hooves muffled by mud or late snow. He'd leave packages wrapped in brown paper on the preacher's porch, a brace of rabbits, a sack of pine nuts, or a pouch of coins earned from his latest fur sales. Once, he included a primer book he'd found in a trading post, its pages only slightly foxed. He never knocked, never waited to be thanked, but sometimes, as he turned his horse toward home, he'd see a lamp flicker in an upstairs window. The thought of Kim sleeping safe and warm in that house eased something in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. Spring proper arrived with a rush of green and birdsong. Emmanuel's trap lines needed moving to follow the changing patterns of game, keeping him busy in the high country. Still, he found himself drawn back to town more often than his trading required. One bright May morning, he rode in with a load of prime beaver pelts. The general store's porch was crowded with the usual Saturday bustle, farmers arguing crop prices, women comparing fabric samples, children darting between adults' legs. Emmanuel tied his horse and shouldered his way through, trying to ignore the way conversations hushed at his approach. Then a familiar voice rang out, clear and confident. "Mr. Harrison, here's your bread portion." "God bless you." Emmanuel turned to see Kim standing beside Martha Wilkes at a table near the church steps. They were handing out fresh loaves to a line of tired-looking men and women, the railroad workers' families, by their worn clothes and coal-stained hands. Kim wore a clean calico dress, her hair neatly braided, as she carefully recorded each recipient's name in a ledger. The sight stopped Emmanuel in his tracks. This poised young helper was a far cry from the half-wild beggar child he'd found at the livery. She carried herself differently now, straight-backed and sure, meeting people's eyes with gentle dignity. Kim spotted him and waved, her face lighting up. "Emmanuel!" "Look, We're giving out bread to those in need. Mrs. Wilkes taught me to keep the records and everything." Emmanuel moved closer, nodding to Martha. "That so?" "Kim's been a wonderful help," Martha said warmly. "She has quite a head for organization." "Preacher says we should share our blessings," Kim explained, earnest and proud. "I don't have to beg anymore. Now I can help others instead." She straightened the neat stack of loaves. "Just like you helped me." Emmanuel cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the curious eyes watching their exchange. "Well, that's good work you're doing." Kim beamed at the gruff praise. Emmanuel found himself noticing how much healthier she looked. Cheeks full, eyes bright, skin glowing with the clean shine of regular washing. The preacher's care had transformed her from a half-starved waif into a proper young lady. "Will you stay for supper?" Kim asked hopefully. "Mrs. Wilkes is making chicken and dumplings." Emmanuel shifted uncomfortably. "Got pelts to deliver." "Oh." Kim's face fell slightly, but she rallied quickly. "Well, maybe next time? I've learned to make biscuits almost as good as Mrs. Wilkes now." Before Emmanuel could form an answer, Preacher Wilkes appeared from the church door. "Ah, Emmanuel, good to see you, friend. And you absolutely must stay for supper, I insist. Those pelts will keep another hour or two." Emmanuel recognized the gentle but firm tone that had convinced many a reluctant soul how into the church pews. He found himself nodding despite his usual instinct to refuse. The meal was everything promised: tender chicken, fluffy dumplings, and indeed, very respectable biscuits that Kim served with visible pride. Emmanuel sat stiffly at first, unused to proper table manners after so long eating alone. But the preacher's family had a way of putting people at ease, filling the air with comfortable chatter about town happenings and scripture lessons. Kim told him about learning to sew, showing off the neat stitches on her apron hem. She described helping Martha with the church accounts, and recited a Bible verse she'd memorized that week. Emmanuel noticed she'd learned to moderate her excitement, speaking clearly instead of tumbling over her words as she once had. "She's coming along splendidly," Preacher Wilkes remarked as Kim helped Martha clear the dishes. "Bright as a new penny, and such a willing heart for service." He gave Emmanuel a thoughtful look. "You did a good thing, bringing her to us that night?" Emmanuel shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Wasn't right, leaving her to starve." "No, indeed." The preacher's eyes twinkled. "Though I hear tell you promised her more than just a meal." "Something about a future proposal?" Emmanuel's chest tightened. He forced a laugh. "Just foolishness, trying to cheer her up." "Ah, but sometimes such jests carry more truth than we know." Preacher Wilkes leaned back in his chair. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Emmanuel. That small kindness of yours may have started something larger than you intended." Emmanuel stared into his coffee cup, troubled by the preacher's words. He remembered the moment clearly. The skinny, desperate child, the way her face had lit up at his teasing promise. He'd meant only to give her hope for one cold night. He hadn't expected that hope to take root and grow. But watching Kim move confidently around the kitchen, helping Martha with the evening tasks, Emmanuel felt the weight of that casual promise settle more heavily on his heart. The ragged beggar girl was disappearing day by day, replaced by a young lady of growing grace and capability, and somehow, without his quite noticing, her future had become tangled with his own. Emmanuel made his excuses soon after, claiming his pelts needed attention. Kim walked him to his horse, chattering about the church's plans for a spring festival. "You'll come, won't you?" she asked. "There's to be music and dancing." Emmanuel busied himself checking his saddle straps. "We'll see." "That means no," Kim said, but without bitterness. "It's all right." "I know you don't like crowds." She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for the primer book. Mrs. Wilkes says I'm reading very well now." Emmanuel nodded, throat tight. He mounted quickly, eager to escape back to his familiar solitude. But as he rode away, he found himself glancing back. Kim stood in the lamplight from the preacher's porch, waving until he turned the corner. The spring night was alive with peeper frogs and the first lightning bugs of the season. Emmanuel let his horse pick its own pace through the darkness, his mind full of troubled thoughts. That old jest about marriage didn't seem so simple anymore. It had become something real in Kim's mind, a north star she was steering by, shaping herself toward. And if Emmanuel was honest, it had become something real in his heart too, though he wasn't ready to examine that too closely. For now, he would do what he'd always done: watch over her from a distance, provide what help he could, and trust that the preacher's family would continue molding her into the fine young woman she was becoming. The mountain trail beckoned, promising the comfort of his solitary cabin. But somehow the thought of his empty hearth brought less peace than it once had. Spring was a season of change, after all, and not even a mountain man could remain untouched by its persistent stirring. The seasons flowed like water through a mountain stream, each year marking subtle changes in the rhythms of town life. Emmanuel noticed them mainly in the growing height of the cottonwood saplings along the creek, and in Kim's gradual transformation from gangly child to poised young woman. He kept to his ways, tracking game through snowdrifts and trading pelts when supplies ran low. But his visits to town, though still rare, carried new purpose. He'd linger at the general store, listening to gossip about Kim's progress in her studies or her help with the preacher's Sunday school. One crisp autumn morning in 1876, Emmanuel rode down from his cabin, pack horses loaded with beaver pelts. The maples blazed red against the mountains, and morning frost silvered the grass. He hadn't been to town since early summer, but something in the air told him change was coming. The town had grown. New clapboard buildings stretched further along Main Street, and the railroad depot bustled with activity. Emmanuel tied his horses at the trading post, noting how the familiar dirt paths had been replaced with wooden sidewalks. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself," old Jake called from behind his counter. The trader's beard had gone fully white now, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Brought some fine pelts, I expect?" Emmanuel nodded, unloading his goods. As Jake examined the furs, Emmanuel's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, Kim walked past with Martha Wilkes, carrying books and papers. At 17, she'd grown tall and graceful, her dark hair neatly pinned up like a proper lady's. Something in Emmanuel's chest tightened at the sight. "She's leaving tomorrow, you know," Jake remarked, following his look. "Going east to that fancy mission school in St. Louis. Preacher's wife is taking her." Emmanuel's hands stilled on the pelts. "That so?" "Yep. Town raised money to help send her, seeing as she's set on becoming a teacher herself." Jake chuckled. "Who'd have thought that little beggar girl would turn out so fine?" "Course you had something to do with that, bringing her to the preacher that night." Emmanuel grunted, uncomfortable with the praise. He finished his business quickly, then stepped out onto the sidewalk. The autumn air carried wood smoke and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. He stood uncertain, watching Kim and Martha disappear into the church. After a moment's hesitation, he followed. The church door creaked as he entered, and Kim looked up from where she was helping Martha sort primers and slates. "Emmanuel!" Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "We didn't expect you today." "Heard you were leaving," he said gruffly. "Yes, tomorrow morning." Kim straightened, smoothing her skirts. "Mrs. Wilkes is taking me to the mission school in St. Louis. I'm to train as a teacher." Her eyes shone with excitement. "Can you imagine?" Me, teaching children their letters and numbers? Emmanuel could imagine it all too well. He'd seen how patient she was with the younger children at Sunday school, how clearly she explained things. "You'll do fine," he managed. Martha tactfully excused herself to check on something in the church kitchen, leaving them alone among the neat rows of pews. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching dust motes in its beams. "Will you write to me?" Kim asked suddenly. "I know you don't hold much with letters, but—" She trailed off, coloring slightly. Emmanuel shifted his weight. "Don't write much at all," he admitted. "No, I suppose not." Kim bent to straighten a stack of books, hiding her disappointment. "But you'll still come to town sometimes? The preacher says I can visit at Christmas, if the weather permits." "Reckon I might?" Emmanuel's voice came out, rougher than he intended. Kim studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket. "I have something for you." She pulled out a carefully folded square of white cloth. "I made it myself." Emmanuel took the kerchief, running his thumb over the neat embroidery in one corner, his initials in blue thread, with a small mountain flower beneath. The stitching was fine and even, showing hours of careful work. "So you won't forget me," Kim said softly. Emmanuel's throat felt tight. "Ain't likely to do that." She smiled then, the same bright smile that had first touched his heart when she was a hungry child at the livery. But now it held something more, a woman's understanding, tinged with gentle humor. "I still remember what you promised that first night," she said, "about marrying me when I grew up." Her cheeks flushed pink, but she met his eyes steadily. "I know it was just a jest to comfort a scared little girl, but it gave me hope when I needed it most." Emmanuel stared at the kerchief in his hands, unable to find words. The promise had been a foolish thing, spoken without thought. But somehow it had taken root, growing alongside Kim herself into something both beautiful and terrifying. "I should help Mrs. Wilkes with the packing," Kim said after a moment. She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you, Emmanuel. For everything." He watched her walk away, her skirts swishing softly against the wooden floor. The kerchief in his hands seemed to hold all the weight of passing years, of the stubborn child becoming this poised young woman who now prepared to make her own way in the world. Early the next morning, Emmanuel stood in the shadows of the livery, watching as Kim's trunk was loaded into the wagon. The town had turned out to bid her farewell, women pressing packets of food into her hands, children tugging at her skirts for one last hug. Preacher Wilkes helped his wife up onto the wagon seat, then lifted Kim beside her. As the wagon began to roll, Kim's eyes found Emmanuel in his hiding place. She raised her hand in farewell, and he touched the kerchief tucked inside his coat. The wagon rounded the bend, taking with it something Emmanuel hadn't known he needed until it was gone, the warmth of being someone's North Star, someone's reason to hope. The townspeople drifted back to their morning routines, but Emmanuel stayed, watching the empty road. The autumn wind rustled through yellowing leaves, carrying winter's first whisper. Soon enough, snow would blanket the high country, and Emmanuel would return to his solitary ways. But something had shifted, like ice breaking up on a spring-swollen river. The comfortable, familiar patterns of his mountain life suddenly seemed emptier, echoing with absence. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, the weight of Kim's kerchief resting against his heart. Behind him, the town stirred with morning activity, the blacksmith's hammer ringing, children's voices in the schoolyard, the distant whistle of an approaching train. All the sounds of a world moving forward, changing, growing beyond the simple promise made to a hungry child on a winter's night. The summer of 1879 brought change to the frontier town like a warm Chinook wind. New shops lined Main Street, and telegraph wires stretched between fresh-painted poles. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as the eastbound stage rolled in, wheels clattering against stone. Kim stepped down from the coach, her dark traveling dress neat despite the long journey. 3 years of education had added polish to her bearing, but couldn't quite hide the determined spirit that had once sustained a hungry child. She smiled, breathing in the familiar scent of sage and pine that drifted down from the mountains. "Welcome home, Miss Thompson," Martha Wilkes hurried forward to embrace her former ward. "My, how well you look." "It's good to be back," Kim said, returning the hug. She glanced around at the familiar faces gathering to greet her, some warm with welcome, others holding back, watching. Their whispers carried on the evening breeze. "That's the Beggar girl. Educated now, they say. Still remember her scrounging at the livery." Kim lifted her chin slightly, refusing to let old hurts dim her happiness. She'd worked hard for her teaching certificate, determined to make something of herself. The sideways glances couldn't touch her now. "The schoolhouse is all ready for you," Martha said, linking arms with Kim as they walked. "We've got 23 pupils enrolled for the fall term." They passed the trading post where Jake stood in the doorway, giving Kim a friendly wave. Beyond him, tied to the hitching rail, stood a familiar dun horse with a white star on its forehead. Kim's heart quickened. Emmanuel was in town. The church social that evening brought most of the town together in the parish hall. Kerosene lamps cast a warm glow over laden tables and chattering groups. Kim stood near the punch bowl, accepting congratulations on her new position as schoolteacher, while scanning the room for a certain tall figure. Emmanuel arrived late, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. His clothes were clean but trail-worn, and his dark hair showed touches of silver at the temples. At nearly 40, he carried himself with the same quiet strength she remembered, though new lines creased the corners of his eyes. Their gazes met across the crowded room. For a moment, the noise and bustle seemed to fade away. Emmanuel gave a slight nod, and Kim felt warmth spread through her chest. She started to move toward him, but Mrs. Carson stepped into her path. My, if it isn't our new schoolmistress," the older woman said, voice carrying. "And look who just arrived, your promised husband himself." Nearby conversations stuttered to a halt. Kim felt heat rise in her cheeks as heads turned their way. "Now, surely you remember," Mrs. Carson continued, eyes glinting with malicious humor. "That night at the livery, when Mr. Harkins here promised to marry you once you grew up? Well, I'd say you're plenty grown now." Titters rippled through the crowd. Emmanuel's jaw tightened, and he took a half-step back toward the door. "That was just a kind jest to comfort a frightened child," Kim said firmly. "Mr. Harkins has been a good friend to me, nothing more." But the damage was done. Whispers buzzed around the room like angry bees. Improper, making such promises to a child. Mountain man with no proper raising. What was he thinking, taking such interest in a beggar girl? Emmanuel's expression had gone carefully blank, the way it did when he was hurting. Without a word, he turned and strode out into the darkness. Kim wanted to follow, to ease that look from his face, but Martha's hand on her arm held her back. "Best let him be, dear," the preacher's wife murmured. "People will talk enough as it is." The social continued, but Kim's heart wasn't in it. She made polite conversation and picked at a plate of food, all too aware of the speculative glances and whispered comments. The old joke that had once given her hope now cast shadows on both their reputations. Later that night, Kim lay awake in her small room above the schoolhouse, watching moonlight pattern the floor through lace curtains. She thought of Emmanuel's face when Mrs. Carson spoke, of all the quiet ways he'd cared for her over the years, food left on the porch, money for school books, pelts traded to buy her winter boots. He'd never asked for recognition or thanks, content to help from the shadows. Across town, Emmanuel sat on his bedroll in the livery loft, unable to sleep. The mockery in those whispers had stung, but worse was the thought that his foolish words years ago might now harm Kim's standing in the community. She'd worked so hard to rise above her beginnings, to make something of herself. He pressed his palms against his eyes, remembering her smile across the lamplit room, the grace with which she'd handled Mrs. Carson's needling. The sound of horses shuffling in their stalls drifted up through the floorboards. Emmanuel pulled out the kerchief Kim had given him 3 years ago, running his thumb over the faded embroidery. The blue thread had held its color, like the memory of a young girl's determined spirit. Now that girl had become a woman of substance and education, while he remained what he'd always been, a rough mountain man more at home with traplines than social niceties. In her room, Kim traced patterns on the window pane, remembering the feel of Emmanuel's strong hands helping her onto his horse when she was small, the gruff kindness in his voice when he praised her progress. She'd carried those memories through lonely nights at school, drawing strength from knowing someone had believed in her worth when she was nothing but a ragged beggar. The moon sailed behind a cloud, shadows deepening across the sleeping town. In separate rooms, two hearts beat with unspoken words, while gossip wound through the darkness like morning mist, promising storms to come. Dawn would bring a new day of respectable duties and careful distances. But for now, in the quiet hours, Kim and Emmanuel each held their private thoughts of what might have been, what might yet be, if only the world were a simpler place. The one-room schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, its weathered boards glowing honey gold in the morning sun. Kim arrived early each day, sweeping the wooden steps and arranging primers on the scarred desks before her pupils arrived. By 8 o'clock, 23 children filled the room with the rustle of slate boards and whispered conversations. "Good morning, class," Kim called out, tapping her brass bell. The children scrambled to attention, though a few cast anxious glances toward the windows. Outside, several town ladies stood in a cluster, peering in with disapproving expressions. "Miss Thompson," little Sarah Wilson raised her hand. "My ma says I ain't supposed to sit next to Joseph no more." She pointed to the quiet boy beside her, whose mother was Lakota. Kim straightened her shoulders. "In this classroom, we're all here to learn together. Joseph is one of our best readers." She smiled at the dark-haired boy, who ducked his head shyly. "Now, let's begin with our scripture verse." The morning passed in a rhythm of lessons: arithmetic, penmanship, geography. Kim moved between the rows, helping small fingers form letters and sound out difficult words. When Tommy Fletcher, whose father worked as a stable hand, arrived without lunch again, she quietly shared her own bread and apple with him. A sharp rap at the door interrupted the afternoon reading lesson. Emmanuel stood in the doorway, tools slung over one shoulder and fresh-cut lumber under his arm. "Door's hanging crooked," he said gruffly. "Thought I'd fix it before winter sets in." The children whispered and giggled. Kim felt warmth rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Harkins." "That's very kind." Emmanuel worked efficiently, planing the wood and adjusting the hinges while Kim continued teaching. She was acutely aware of his presence, the quiet strength in his movements, the way he paused occasionally to listen when she read aloud from Robinson Crusoe. "The mountain man's sweet on teacher," one of the older girls whispered, setting off another round of giggles. "Sarah Jane Miller, please focus on your lesson," Kim said firmly, though her heart fluttered at the words. The repair took longer than strictly necessary. Emmanuel tested the door multiple times, adjusted minute details, swept up every wood shaving. Through the windows, Kim could see Mrs. Carson and her friends watching, heads bent together in conversation. When school finally dismissed, Emmanuel still lingered, examining the roof beams. "Might need some work up there before snow flies," he mused. "You've done more than enough," Kim said softly. "People are already talking." His jaw tightened. "Let them talk. Roof needs fixing all the same." "Emmanuel." She stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. "Thank you. For everything." He nodded once, gathering his tools. The late afternoon sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair, highlighting the weathered lines around his eyes. Kim wanted to reach out, to smooth the tension from his face, but voices approached from outside. "Best be going," Emmanuel muttered, striding away as Mrs. Carson and her friends entered with exaggerated surprise. "Why, Mr. Harkins? Fancy finding you here again?" Mrs. Carson trilled. Such interest in education you've developed lately." Emmanuel touched his hat brim without speaking and disappeared around the corner. The ladies descended on Kim with concerns about her teaching methods, particularly her insistence on treating all children equally regardless of background. Kim stood her ground politely but firmly until they finally departed. Later that afternoon, Kim walked to the mercantile for supplies. The store was nearly empty except for two well-dressed men examining maps spread across the counter. Railroad men, by their city clothes and smooth manner of speaking. "Afternoon, miss," the taller one called out as she selected pencils and paper. "New school teacher, aren't you?" "We've heard interesting stories about you." Kim kept her expression neutral. "I need to be going." "Now don't run off." The second man stepped closer, blocking her path. "Pretty thing like you must get lonely out here. Why don't you join us for supper? We could talk about your colorful past." "Excuse me." Kim tried to step around him, but he caught her arm. "Come on, sweetheart. No need to play proper lady with us. Everyone knows where you came from." "Take your hand off her." Emmanuel's quiet voice cut through the store like a knife. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting near his belt. The railroad men exchanged glances. "This is a private conversation, Mountain Man." "Not anymore, it ain't!" Emmanuel moved forward, his presence filling the small space. "Miss Thompson has business to attend to. I suggest you let her see to it." The tension crackled for a long moment before the men backed away with forced laughs. "No offense meant," the taller one said, "just being friendly." Emmanuel waited until they left, then gestured to Kim. "I'll walk you back." They walked in silence through the deepening evening. Kim's arm still tingled where the stranger had grabbed her, but Emmanuel's solid presence beside her eased the trembling in her hands. "Thank you," she said finally, "though I suppose this will give people more to gossip about." Emmanuel grunted. "Don't care what they say about me." "No, you never have." Kim stopped walking, turning to face him. The setting sun painted the mountains purple behind them, crickets beginning their evening song. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" "At the livery?" Emmanuel's shoulders tensed. "Kim, you said you'd marry me when I grew up." She took a deep breath. "I'm grown now." "It was just words to cheer up a scared child," Emmanuel said roughly, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering away from her steady gaze. "Was it?" Kim stepped closer. "All these years, all the ways you've cared for me, was that just words too?" Emmanuel stood frozen, conflict etched in every line of his weathered face. The truth hung between them, unspoken but impossible to deny. That long-ago jest had grown into something real, something that terrified him with its power to hurt them both. "You're a respected teacher now," he said finally. "Got no business with the likes of me." "I think that's my choice to make," Kim answered softly. The evening breeze stirred the dust at their feet. Emmanuel's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and for a moment Kim thought he might reach for her. Instead, he took a step back, touching his hat brim. "Evening, Miss Thompson," he said formally, though his voice held a wealth of unspoken feeling. "Best get inside before dark." Kim watched him stride away, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. The truth she'd seen in his eyes gave her hope, even as her heart ached for his struggle. Whatever he might say, that childhood promise had taken root in both their hearts, growing stronger with each passing year. The autumn sun painted long shadows across the preacher's garden as Emmanuel made his way up the path, tools jingling at his belt. His weathered hands clutched a handful of fence posts, though his real purpose burned clear in his mind. After a week of sleepless nights following their conversation outside the mercantile, he could no longer hide from the truth in his heart. Mrs. Wilkes opened the door before he could knock. "Why, Mr. Harkins," she said, her eyes twinkling knowingly. "That fence giving trouble again?" "Yes'm," Emmanuel cleared his throat. Thought I'd see to it before winter comes." How thoughtful. Kim's out back tending the vegetables. She stepped aside, adding softly, "Take your time with those repairs." Emmanuel nodded, grateful for her gentle understanding. He found Kim kneeling among the late tomatoes, her dark hair escaping its pins in the breeze. She looked up at his approach, cheeks flushing pink. "More repairs?" she asked, brushing dirt from her skirts as she stood. "Fence needs mending." Emmanuel set the posts down carefully. "Thought we might talk while I work." Kim's eyes softened. "I'd like that." They walked together to the back fence, where a few posts had indeed worked loose over the summer. Emmanuel began digging, the familiar work steadying his nerves. Kim settled on a nearby stump, watching him with quiet intensity. "You've been avoiding me this past week," she said finally. Emmanuel paused, leaning on his shovel. "Been thinking hard on things." "What things?" "That night at the livery." He drew a deep breath. "Those words I spoke." Kim's fingers twisted in her apron. "You said it was just to cheer up a hungry child." Tried to tell myself that. Emmanuel drove the shovel into the earth with particular force. Tried to believe it was just kindness, nothing more. "And now?" Kim's voice wavered slightly. Emmanuel stopped working entirely, turning to face her. The setting sun caught her face, reminding him of that first evening when a stubborn, hungry child had captured his heart without his knowing. "Now I can't lie to myself no more," he said roughly. "Can't lie to you neither." Kim stood slowly, hope dawning in her eyes. "Emmanuel, I love you." The words burst from him like water through a broken dam. "Reckon I have for years, though I fought against admitting it. Told myself I was too old, too rough, too solitary for the likes of you." "I don't care about any of that." Kim stepped closer, her eyes shining. "I never have." "You should care." Emmanuel's hands clenched at his sides. "Folk in town already whisper about your past. Marrying a mountain man won't help that none." "Let them whisper." Kim reached out, touching his weathered cheek. "I was a beggar child, and you showed me kindness when no one else would. Everything I am today started with that kindness." Emmanuel caught her hand, pressing it against his face. "You became something fine all on your own. I just helped a little at the start." "You did more than that." Kim's voice grew fierce. "You gave me hope." "A reason to prove myself worthy. Every time you brought food or firewood, every time you fixed something broken, you showed me what real love looks like." Emmanuel's throat tightened. "Kim, I ain't a proper gentleman. Got no fine house to offer, no social standing." "I don't want a proper gentleman." She stepped closer still, close enough that he could count her eyelashes. "I want the man who saw a hungry child and fed her. Who protected her when others scorned her. Who loved her enough to stay away when he thought it best for her future." "Lord help me," Emmanuel whispered hoarsely. "I do love you. More than I ever thought possible." "Then stop fighting it." Kim's free hand came up to rest against his chest. "Stop worrying about what others might say." Emmanuel looked down at her upturned face, seeing in it all his hopes and fears tangled together. "People will talk. Might make trouble for your teaching." "Let them." A smile tugged at her lips. "I'm rather good at handling troublemakers these days. Had plenty of practice with my students." A chuckle escaped him, rough with emotion. "That you have?" "Emmanuel." Kim's eyes grew serious. "Did you mean those words? That night at the livery, did some part of you mean them truly?" He gathered her hands in his, marveling at how small and strong they felt. "Reckon I did, though I didn't know it then. Something about your courage, even half-starved and freezing, it touched my heart. Made me want to give you hope for better days ahead." "You did." Tears sparkled in her eyes. "You gave me everything." Emmanuel could resist no longer. He drew her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Marry me, Kim Thompson, not because of some jest spoken years ago, but because we've grown to love each other true and proper." "Yes," she whispered against his chest. 1,000 times yes." They stood together in the gathering dusk, hearts beating in shared rhythm. After a long moment, Emmanuel reluctantly loosened his hold. "Should get you back to the house before dark." Kim smiled up at him. "Worried about proper behavior now?" "Aiming to do right by you in all ways," he said seriously. "Want to give folk as little reason to gossip as possible?" Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house. On the porch, Mrs. Wilkes stood wiping tears from her eyes with her apron. "About time," she said warmly. "I've been praying for this day since you first brought that hungry child to our door, Emmanuel Harkins." Emmanuel ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "Thank you for helping raise her right, ma'am." For giving her the home she deserved. She was already special. Mrs. Wilkes embraced Kim tightly. "You just saw it first." That night, long after Kim had gone inside and Emmanuel had ridden back to his cabin, he knelt beside his bed. The last rays of sunset filtered through the window, painting the rough walls gold. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rusty with disuse, "ain't prayed proper in years, not since losing my family to the fever. But I'm asking now, help me be worthy of her love. Help me give her the life she deserves." The evening breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of pine and approaching autumn. Emmanuel felt peace settle over him, as if in answer to his prayer. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tongues might wag, he knew in his heart that loving Kim was right and true. He touched the handkerchief she'd given him years ago, still carefully stored in his coat pocket. From lonely mountain man to promised husband, the journey seemed impossible. Yet here he was, heart full of joy and purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but tonight he would thank God for second chances and love that grew from the smallest seeds of kindness. Emmanuel's boots creaked on the freshly laid floorboards as he surveyed his handiwork. The cabin addition was coming along nicely, a proper bedroom with a window facing east, just as Kim had wished. He'd spent every available moment hauling lumber down from the sawmill, determined to make their future home worthy of his bride. The autumn sunshine slanted through the incomplete walls, catching dust motes in golden beams. Emmanuel paused to wipe sweat from his brow, allowing himself a rare smile. Years of solitude had taught him to work in silence, but nowadays he found himself humming hymns as he labored. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. In town, Kim sat at the preacher's wife's kitchen table, surrounded by clouds of white fabric. Mrs. Wilkes had insisted on helping with the wedding dress, claiming her eyes were sharper for fine stitching. Together they worked steadily, adding delicate tucks and tiny pearl buttons that Mrs. Wilkes had saved from her own wedding dress. "You're glowing, dear," Mrs. Wilkes observed, threading her needle with practiced ease. "I don't think I've ever seen you so happy." Kim's fingers stilled on the fabric. "I never dreamed I could be this happy. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a wonderful dream." "No dream," Mrs. Wilkes assured her, patting her hand. "Though I must say, watching Emmanuel Harkins turn into a regular churchgoer is something of a miracle." They shared a knowing laugh. Emmanuel had indeed become a fixture at Sunday services, his tall frame occupying the same pew each week beside Kim. Though he still wore his plainest shirt and kept his responses quiet, his presence spoke volumes to the congregation. The following Sunday found them sitting together as usual, Emmanuel's shoulder brushing Kim's as they shared a hymnal. Some of the older women who had once whispered about that beggar girl now smiled warmly at the couple. Even stern-faced Mrs. Patterson had brought a basket of preserved peaches for the wedding supper. Preacher Wilkes delivered his sermon on Ruth's faithfulness, his kind eyes often straying to Kim and Emmanuel. The message of love overcoming hardship touched something deep in Emmanuel's heart. As the congregation bowed their heads for the final prayer, he felt Kim's small hand slip into his. Walking home in the gathering dusk, they lingered at the church gate. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching frost. Emmanuel adjusted Kim's shawl around her shoulders, his touch gentle. "Roof'll be done by week's end," he said. "Then just the chimney to finish." Kim beamed up at him. "I can hardly wait to see it complete. Will you let me help with the whitewashing?" "Reckon that'd be proper," Emmanuel replied, his eyes crinkling. "Being as it'll be your home too." The word home hung between them like a prayer. Kim stretched up on tiptoe to kiss his cheek, quick and shy despite the deepening shadows. Emmanuel's heart swelled with a joy he'd never thought to experience again after losing his family years ago. Their peaceful moment shattered at the sound of breaking glass and angry shouts from the direction of the saloon. Most townsfolk paid little mind to such disturbances. Saturday night brawls were common enough. But this voice carried something different, something that made Kim freeze mid-step. "Where is she?" The raw bellow echoed down the street. "Where's my girl?" "Kim! Kim Thompson!" Emmanuel felt Kim's hand turn to ice in his grasp. Her face had gone white as paper, eyes wide with recognition and terror. Before he could move to shield her, a figure lurched into view under the lamplight. The man was ragged and unwashed, his clothes hanging in tatters from his swaying frame. A week's worth of beard couldn't hide the familiar set of his jaw, the same determination that Emmanuel had first admired in a hungry child's face years ago. The stranger clutched a half-empty whiskey bottle, using it to gesture wildly as he shouted. "There you are!" His bloodshot eyes fixed on Kim. "My own flesh and blood standing there fine as cream gravy while your poor father wanders homeless." The few townspeople still abroad stopped to stare. Emmanuel stepped forward, placing himself between Kim and the approaching drunk. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance? Best move along." "Move along?" The man's laugh was ugly. "That's my daughter you're standing in front of, mister. Ain't seen her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, but I'd know those eyes anywhere. Got her mother's eyes, she does." Kim's fingers dug into Emmanuel's arm. He could feel her trembling, though her voice came out steady. "Father? You left us. Mother died waiting for you to come back. Now, girl, that ain't fair." Her father swayed, nearly losing his balance. "I was always meaning to return. Just had some bad luck is all. But I'm here now, ain't I? Ready to be a proper father to my girl." More people were gathering, drawn by the commotion. Emmanuel could see Preacher Wilkes hurrying down the church steps, concern etched on his face. Mrs. Wilkes followed close behind, her hand pressed to her mouth in dismay. 15 years, Kim said, her voice growing stronger. 15 years without a word. Why now? The drunk's face twisted. "Heard tell my girl was fixing to marry some mountain man. Had to come see for myself." He squinted at Emmanuel. "This the fellow? Bit long in the tooth, ain't he?" Emmanuel felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "Sir, you're welcome to call on Kim tomorrow when you're sober. For now, I suggest you find yourself a bed at the boarding house." "Don't you tell me when I can see my own daughter!" The bottle went flying, smashing against a hitching post. Several women in the crowd gasped. "I got rights." A father's rights. "Rights," Kim stepped out from behind Emmanuel, though he tried to hold her back. "What rights? The right to abandon your child? The right to let your wife die alone while you drank away every penny?" "Kim," Emmanuel murmured, "let's get you inside." But Kim stood her ground, years of buried pain rising to the surface. "I was 9 years old when Mother died. 9 years old and begging in the streets because my father cared more for whiskey than his family." Her father's face darkened. Now see here. That's enough. Preacher Wilkes's calm voice cut through the tension. Brother, you're not yourself tonight. Come along to the boarding house. We can sort this out in the morning. Don't need your Christian charity, the drunk spat, but his anger seemed to deflate somewhat. Just came to see my girl. Heard she was doing well for herself, teaching school and all. His bleary eyes fixed on Kim again. Thought maybe you might have a place for your old pa. The naked need in his voice made Kim flinch. Emmanuel felt her sway slightly and steadied her with a gentle hand at her waist. The watching crowd had grown silent, holding their collective breath. Please, Kim whispered, please just go. Come back tomorrow if you must, but go now. For a moment, it seemed her father might argue further. Then his shoulders slumped, and he allowed Preacher Wilkes to take his arm. Always was a disappointment to you, wasn't I? Just like your mother said. As the preacher led him away, Kim turned and buried her face in Emmanuel's chest. He could feel her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The townspeople began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves. Tomorrow the gossip would spread like wildfire. The schoolteacher's drunkard father, the shameful family history exposed. Mrs. Wilkes approached quietly. Come inside, dear. I'll make you some tea. Emmanuel gathered Kim closer, protecting her from curious eyes. I'll see her home safe, ma'am. They walked slowly through the deepening dark, Kim clinging to Emmanuel's arm as if it were a lifeline. Neither spoke until they reached the preacher's porch, where lamplight spilled warmly through the windows. I never thought he'd come back, Kim finally whispered. I prayed for years that he would, and then I prayed he wouldn't. Does that make me a terrible daughter? Emmanuel cupped her face gently between his rough hands. Makes you human is all. Ain't nothing terrible about protecting your heart from those who hurt it. What will people say? The whole town knows now. Knows exactly what I came from. Let them talk. Emmanuel's voice was firm. Ain't nothing changed about who you are. Still the bravest, strongest woman I know. Kim managed a wavering smile. Will you stay in town tonight? I know it's not proper, but I don't want you up in your cabin if he... I'll bed down in the livery, Emmanuel assured her. Won't be far if you need me. He waited until she was safely inside before walking to the stable, his mind troubled. The peaceful happiness of recent weeks seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by this ghost from Kim's past. But as he settled into the hay, Emmanuel's determination only grew stronger. They would face this together, just as they had faced the town's prejudices. Love, he was learning, meant standing firm when storms came. The morning sun had barely touched the church steeple when Kim's father stumbled back into town. His night at the boarding house hadn't sobered him much. He'd clearly found a fresh bottle somewhere. Emmanuel, who'd kept his promise to stay close by, bedding down in the livery, spotted the man weaving down the street toward the schoolhouse. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Emmanuel intercepted him. School ain't started yet, mister. Best come back later. Kim's father squinted at him through bloodshot eyes. Ain't here for school. Hear about my daughter's marriage. He jabbed a dirty finger at Emmanuel's chest. You ain't marrying her without my say-so? I'm her father. Got rights. Emmanuel kept his voice steady, though his hands wanted to curl into fists. Kim's of age to make her own choice. That so? The man's laugh was harsh as a crow's. Well then, maybe we can come to an arrangement. He leaned closer, breath sour with whiskey. Proper thing would be to offer the father something, for his blessing, you might say. You're asking for money? Emmanuel's tone went cold as mountain snow. Call it a gift. To release my claim on the girl. He named a sum that made Emmanuel's jaw tighten. Small price to avoid. Complications. The school bell began to ring, and Emmanuel saw Kim approaching down the path, her arms full of books. She stopped short at the sight of them, color draining from her face. Father? What are you doing here? Having a friendly chat with your intended? Her father's smile showed tobacco-stained teeth. Explaining how things work proper-like. There's nothing proper about selling your blessing. Kim's voice shook with anger and shame. Several children had gathered to watch, and behind them, Emmanuel could see curtains twitching in nearby houses as neighbors took notice. Now, girl, that ain't fair. Her father's voice turned wheedling. Just looking out for your interests. Man ought to prove he can provide. Ain't that right? Emmanuel has nothing to prove to you. Kim clutched her books tighter. You lost any right to speak about my future when you left us to starve. The man's face darkened. Watch your tongue, girl. Still your father, drunk or sober. He turned back to Emmanuel. Think on my offer. Cheaper than trouble. Get out of here. Emmanuel's quiet words carried steel. Before I forget to be Christian about this. Kim's father spat in the dust. Uppity mountain man, thinking you're too good for dealing proper with family. Well, let me tell you something. You're marrying Beggar's blood. Everybody knows it now. He raised his voice, playing to the growing crowd of onlookers. My girl there used to beg scraps like any street cur, and here she is, putting on airs as a schoolmarm. That's enough! Emmanuel stepped forward, but Kim's father had already started down the street, calling back over his shoulder. Think on it. Might be worth paying to keep certain stories quiet. The watching children whispered among themselves. Emmanuel could see their parents gathering in doorways, heads bent in conversation. The damage was done. By noon, every soul in town would know the schoolteacher's shameful history. Kim stood rigid, clutching her books like a shield. Children, her voice wavered only slightly. Time for lessons. Inside, please. The students filed in, still whispering. Emmanuel touched Kim's arm gently. Want me to stay? She shook her head. I have to face them sometime. But will you come to supper? At the preacher's house? Count on it. Emmanuel spent the day chopping wood behind the church, staying close in case Kim's father returned. He could hear the buzz of gossip as townspeople passed, their voices dropping to murmurs when they spotted him. By afternoon, new whispers had joined the old, speculation about Emmanuel's own past, questions about his intentions, sly comments about a mountain man courting above his station. The sun was setting when Emmanuel arrived at the preacher's house for supper. Through the window, he could see Kim helping Mrs. Wilkes set the table, her movements mechanical. When he entered, she barely looked up. The meal was quiet, broken only by the clink of utensils and Preacher Wilkes's gentle attempts at conversation. Finally, Kim set down her fork, untouched food growing cold on her plate. Excuse me, she whispered, and fled to the kitchen. Emmanuel found her there, hands braced against the wash basin, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The lamp cast wavering shadows on the walls as he approached carefully. Kim? I can't escape it. Her words came between hitching breaths. No matter how hard I work, how much I learn, I'll always be the beggar girl, and now everyone knows exactly what I came from. Emmanuel turned her gently to face him. Look at me, Kim. He waited until she raised her tear-stained face. What you came from don't matter. It's what you did with it that counts. But the talk, the children's parents, fresh tears spilled. Some already said they won't send their children to a teacher with such connections. Then they're fools. Emmanuel's rough thumbs brushed her cheeks. Ain't your father's sins that make you who you are. It's your own heart, the way you turned suffering into kindness. Remember how proud I was, seeing you giving bread to the poor instead of begging it? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You said I'd done good that day. And I meant it. He drew her close, letting her bury her face against his chest. Your worth ain't in your blood or your past. It's in how you rise above it. They stood quiet for a moment, the lamp flickering soft shadows around them. Then Kim whispered, "What if he comes back? What if he keeps making trouble?" Emmanuel's arms tightened protectively. "Then we'll face it. Together." But later, after Kim had composed herself and rejoined the preacher's family, Emmanuel stood alone on the back porch, watching night settle over the town. Doubt gnawed at his heart like winter wind. He'd promised to protect her, but how could he shield her from wagging tongues and sideways looks? The town's judgment could crush a person sure as any physical blow. He remembered Kim's face that morning, rigid with shame as her father aired their history before her students. The thought of her enduring such humiliation day after day made his chest ache. Was he being selfish, wanting to marry her? Would she be better off leaving town, starting fresh somewhere his reputation as a rough mountain man wouldn't add to her burden? The back door creaked, and Preacher Wilkes stepped out to join him. For a while, they stood in companionable silence, watching stars appear in the deepening dark. Finally, the preacher spoke quietly. "Having doubts, brother?" Emmanuel sighed. "Just wondering if I can protect her from all this. Maybe she'd be better off." "Stop right there." Wilkes's voice was firm. "That girl in there has faced worse than gossip and come through it stronger. Don't you go making decisions about what's best for her without asking her opinion." "But her father is a trial, sure enough. But trials either break us or strengthen us, sometimes both." The preacher laid a weathered hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "The question ain't whether you can shield her from every storm. It's whether you'll stand beside her while she weathers them." Emmanuel nodded slowly, drawing comfort from the older man's wisdom. Inside, he could hear Kim's voice, stronger now, as she helped Mrs. Wilkes clear the supper dishes. The sound stirred something deep in his chest, a fierce protective love mixed with pride in her resilience. Whatever came, he wouldn't let her face it alone. They'd build their life together, proving through quiet dignity that love could overcome any scandal. But still, watching the town lights wink out one by one, Emmanuel couldn't quite silence the whisper of doubt in his heart. Could their love truly withstand the weight of so much judgment? The next morning dawned gray and bitter. Emmanuel stood at his cabin window, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. Below in town, smoke rose from chimneys in thin, wavering lines that disappeared into the heavy sky. 3 days had passed since Kim's father arrived, and each one brought fresh wounds. The man haunted the saloons, spinning tales between drinks about his abandoned daughter. Some stories painted him as the victim, a grieving widower forced to leave his child while seeking work. Others cast darker shadows, hinting at Kim's mother's character and bad blood in the family. Emmanuel's jaw clenched as he recalled the previous afternoon. He'd been mending the schoolhouse steps when 2 women passed, their whispers carrying clearly in the still air. "Heard her father say Emmanuel's paying him off, buying himself a young wife." "Well, what can you expect from mountain folk? Probably thinks he's doing her a favor, lifting her from the dirt she came from." Their words had burned like acid. Worse was seeing Kim's face when she emerged from the schoolhouse, knowing by her tight expression that she'd heard every word. Now, Emmanuel pulled on his coat, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Sleep had been elusive, his mind churning with doubts. Outside, his horse nickered softly as he approached the barn. "Morning, old friend," he murmured, running a hand over the animal's velvet nose. The familiar routine of feeding and grooming brought little comfort today. His thoughts kept circling back to Kim's face at supper last night, pale and drawn as she picked at her food. "I could return to the mission school," she'd said quietly, after the preacher's family had retired. "Just for a while, until things settle." "No." Emmanuel had been firm, though his heart ached at her suggestion. "Running won't solve anything." But in the dark hours before dawn, he'd wondered if she was right. Perhaps distance would let the gossip die down, give people time to forget her father's dramatic arrival. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail drew his attention. Through the barn door, he spotted Kim riding up on her borrowed mare, her skirts arranged carefully for propriety. His chest tightened at the sight of her, so young, so determined to face the world with dignity despite everything. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, dismounting gracefully. Her voice carried forced cheerfulness, but Emmanuel could see the shadows under her eyes. She hadn't slept well either. "Shouldn't you be at the schoolhouse?" He kept his tone gentle, not wanting to add to her burden. Kim's smile faltered. "Mrs. Peterson came by the preacher's house this morning. She's withdrawing her children from school, says she can't trust their education to—" Her voice caught. "To someone with my background." Emmanuel's hands tightened on the curry brush he held. "The Peterson kids love you. I've seen how they light up when you praise their work." "That was before they knew what I was." Kim's composure cracked slightly. "What I am." "Stop that." Emmanuel crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her cold hands in his. "You're the same person you were a week ago. Smart, caring, stronger than anyone I know." "Am I?" Her eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. "Sometimes I wonder if I've just been pretending all these years. Playing at being respectable, thinking I could leave the past behind." "You earned every bit of respect you've got," Emmanuel insisted, "through hard work and kindness. Don't let your father's sins make you doubt that." Kim withdrew her hands gently. "But that's just it, Emmanuel. His sins are mine too in the town's eyes, and now they're becoming yours." She turned away, her shoulders tight. "I heard what they're saying, that you're buying me like property, that you're foolish to trust Beggar's blood." "I don't care what they say." But even as he spoke the words, Emmanuel felt their hollowness. Of course he cared. Not for himself, but for how their judgment wounded her. "But I care." Kim's voice was barely above a whisper. "I care that they'll always see you differently now, because of me." "That your reputation?" "My reputation?" Emmanuel's laugh held no humor. "I'm a mountain man who barely darkens the church door except when you're there. The town's already got their opinion of me." "That's not true. They respect you, your work, your honest dealings." Kim turned back to face him, her expression pleading. "I won't be the reason that changes." Emmanuel started to protest, but the words died in his throat. Wasn't this exactly what had kept him awake all night? The fear that their marriage would drag her down, that his love would become another burden for her to bear? "I should go." Kim moved toward her horse. "The children who are still coming will be waiting." Emmanuel watched her mount up, his chest aching with things unsaid. As she turned her horse toward town, a glint of white caught his eye. The kerchief she'd given him years ago, peeking from his coat pocket where he always carried it. "Kim," he called softly. She paused, looking back. "I love you. That ain't changed." Her smile was gentle but sad. "I know. That's what makes this so hard." After she rode away, Emmanuel stood in the barn doorway for a long time, watching storm clouds build over the mountains. Finally, he saddled his horse. He needed space to think, to clear his head of doubt and town gossip. The trail into the high country was familiar as breathing. His horse picked its way surely through stands of pine and over rocky ground, climbing steadily into thinning air. Emmanuel let muscle memory guide them, his thoughts turned inward. He remembered Kim as she was that first night, a skinny child shivering in the livery stable, too proud to beg outright, but hungry enough to hover hopefully near strangers. He'd meant only kindness then, buying her a meal, making that casual jest about marriage. How could he have known those careless words would shape both their lives? The wind picked up as they climbed, carrying the promise of snow. Emmanuel pulled his coat tighter, feeling the kerchief brush against his chest. He drew it out, running the soft fabric between his fingers. Kim's careful stitches had held through years of carrying it, a token of faith, of possibility. But was faith enough? Could love alone stand against the weight of prejudice and scandal? Emmanuel had lived most of his life apart from town judgment, but Kim was bound to that community through her teaching. Every sideways glance, every withdrawn student, every whispered comment would cut her deeply. Near midday, Emmanuel reached a high meadow where he sometimes camped during hunting season. He dismounted, letting his horse graze while he sat with his back against a boulder. Below, the town was barely visible through gaps in the pine forest, a cluster of buildings like children's toys from this distance. The kerchief lay in his open palm, white against his weathered skin, a symbol of everything he wanted, everything he feared to risk. Marrying him would bind Kim forever to scandal, to whispers about the mountain man and his beggar bride. Perhaps she would be better off leaving, starting fresh somewhere her past couldn't follow. But even as the thought formed, Emmanuel remembered the preacher's words from that night on the porch. "Don't you go making decisions about what's best for her without asking her opinion." He closed his fingers around the kerchief. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the mountains, and the first cold drops of rain began to fall. It was time to ride back down. Whatever decisions lay ahead, they would face them together. The town was dark with storm clouds when Emmanuel descended, but he could see light in the schoolhouse windows. Kim would be there, teaching whatever children still came, holding her head high despite everything. His heart swelled with pride and aching tenderness. He touched the kerchief in his pocket, drawing strength from its presence. They had weathered storms before, her father's abandonment, years of separation, the town's initial resistance to their courtship. Somehow they would weather this one too. But as Emmanuel rode toward town, doubt still whispered at the edges of his resolve. The path ahead seemed shrouded in storm clouds, with no clear way through. Dawn mist clung to the pines as preacher Samuel Wilkes guided his horse up the narrow mountain trail. The path twisted through stands of aspen and over trickling streams, climbing steadily toward Emmanuel's cabin. Though he rarely made such journeys nowadays, his old circuit riding skills served him well as he picked his way carefully around loose stones and fallen branches. The smell of wood smoke led him to his destination, a sturdy log cabin tucked against a granite outcropping. Emmanuel stood in the doorway, surprise clear on his weathered face. "Preacher? Everything all right in town?" Concern edged his voice as he stepped forward to take the horse's reins. "As right as it ever is." Samuel dismounted with a grunt, his joints protesting the long ride. "Thought we might share some coffee, if you're willing." Emmanuel nodded, leading the horse to a crude hitching post. "Kim, she's not in trouble." "She's teaching this morning, same as always." Samuel watched Emmanuel's shoulders relax slightly at the news. "Though I reckon her heart's troubled, same as yours." Inside the cabin, Emmanuel busied himself with the coffee pot, keeping his back turned as he worked. The single room was neat but sparse. A narrow bed, a rough table, shelves lined with practical items. Only one touch of softness caught Samuel's eye: a carefully folded white kerchief on the bedside table. "Good coffee," Samuel commented when Emmanuel handed him a tin cup. They settled into chairs by the hearth, where embers still glowed from the morning fire. "Reminds me of my circuit riding days, sharing coffee with lonely souls in high places." Emmanuel stared into his cup. "I ain't lonely, preacher." "No?" Samuel sipped thoughtfully. "Then why are you up here instead of down there, standing beside the woman you love?" "You know why?" Emmanuel's voice was rough. "Towns turned against her because of me. Her father showing up just gave them the excuse they wanted. Since when does Emmanuel Harkins care what the town thinks?" "I care what they do to her. Emmanuel set his cup down hard enough to slosh coffee over the rim. Already lost half her students. Folks won't look her in the eye at church. She deserves better than that. Samuel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Son, do you remember what I told you the night you first admitted you loved her? About how love gets tested? Said it ain't tested when things are easy, Emmanuel muttered. Only when they cost something. That's right. Samuel watched the younger man's face. Question is, what are you willing to pay? Will you give up what's precious because the price seems too high? Emmanuel stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, morning sunlight was burning away the mist, revealing the town below like a toy village in the distance. I'd give anything to protect her, he said roughly, even if it means letting her go. Protect her? Samuel's laugh held no humor. By abandoning her to face their judgment alone? That's not protection, son. That's fear wearing a noble mask. Emmanuel turned, protest rising to his lips, but Samuel continued. You think she's better off without you? Go ask her yourself. Watch her teaching those few children whose parents still trust her. See how she holds her head high, even when folks cross the street to avoid her. Then tell me if what she needs is your protection or your presence. Silence filled the cabin. Emmanuel's hands worked restlessly at his sides, but his eyes never left the distant town. I don't know how to fight this kind of battle, he finally admitted. Give me a wild animal or a broken fence, something I can fix with my hands. But whispers and sideways looks? How do I shield her from those? You don't. Samuel rose, setting his empty cup aside. You stand beside her. You show up every day, doing what needs doing, loving her steady as sunrise. Sometimes that's all the shield anyone needs. Emmanuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to the bedside table and picked up the white kerchief, tucking it carefully into his shirt pocket. Reckon I've got some work to do in town, he said quietly. Samuel smiled. Reckon you do? They rode down together, the morning warming around them. As they approached town, the sound of children's voices carried from the churchyard. Emmanuel reined his horse to a stop, watching the scene before them. Kim stood beneath an oak tree, slate in hand, teaching a small group of children seated on the grass. Samuel counted silently. Only 8 students where there had once been 20. Most were from the poorest families, along with 3 native children whose parents valued education over prejudice. The schoolhouse sits empty, Samuel explained softly, since the town council claimed it needed repairs before classes could continue there. But Kim wouldn't stop teaching. Said if they wouldn't let her use the building, she'd teach wherever she could. Emmanuel's jaw tightened as he watched Kim demonstrate something on her slate. Despite the indignity of being forced outside, her voice carried clearly, patient and encouraging, as she guided her students through their lessons. Without a word, Emmanuel dismounted and led his horse to the hitching post. Samuel watched him stride toward the shuttered schoolhouse, testing the door. Finding it unlocked, Emmanuel disappeared inside. Moments later, the sound of hammering echoed across the yard. Kim paused in her lesson, looking toward the noise. A smile touched her lips, though she quickly returned to teaching. Her students squirmed, curious about the interruption, but she kept their attention focused on their work. Emmanuel emerged carrying a broken bench, one of several the council had declared unsafe. He set it up near his horse, pulled tools from his saddlebags, and began working. Each strike of his hammer drew stares from passers-by. Some hurried past, avoiding his gaze. Others paused, watching with uncertain expressions. Samuel noticed Mrs. Peterson hovering at the corner of the church, clutching her market basket. Her 3 children had been among the first withdrawn from Kim's class. Now she stood watching Emmanuel work, then looking at the small group of students still learning despite everything. The morning wore on. Emmanuel finished the bench and carried it inside, then emerged with another. Kim continued teaching, her voice steady and clear. More townspeople gathered at a distance, drawn by the spectacle of the mountain man's quiet industry. The Good Samaritan showed mercy, Kim was saying, when others passed by on the other side. Who can tell me what mercy means? It means being kind when you don't have to be, offered one of the native children. That's right, Sarah. Kim smiled. And why is mercy important? Because everyone needs it sometimes, ventured another student. Yes, exactly. We all need mercy, and we all can show it to others. Samuel noticed Mrs. Peterson step forward slightly, her hands twisting her basket handle. Her oldest daughter stood beside her now, watching the lesson with obvious longing. Emmanuel finished the second bench and disappeared into the schoolhouse again. The sound of sweeping drifted out the open door. Kim's lesson continued, though her eyes kept straying to the schoolhouse entrance. Perhaps, Samuel suggested quietly to Mrs. Peterson, who had edged closer, your children might like to join the lesson? The grass is free to all, after all. She flushed, glancing around at the other onlookers, but her daughter was already moving forward, drawn by the familiar sound of Kim's teaching voice. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Peterson nodded. The girl slipped into the group of students, who shifted to make room. Kim welcomed her with a warm smile, as if nothing had ever changed. Soon the child was raising her hand, eager to answer questions about the Good Samaritan. Emmanuel emerged once more, carrying a third bench. The steady rhythm of his work filled the yard, testing joints, replacing worn planks, making each piece sturdy and safe. His actions spoke louder than any words of protest could have done. More children appeared as the morning lengthened. Not all, but enough to make Kim's smile brighten as she adjusted her lesson to include them. Their parents hung back, uncertain but watching as Emmanuel continued his quiet labor of love. Samuel observed it all, remembering his words in the cabin about love being tested. Here was the proof of that testing, not in grand gestures or angry confrontations, but in simple faithfulness. In showing up, doing what needed doing, standing firm when others turned away. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the churchyard where Kim taught her growing circle of students. Emmanuel's hammer rang out steady and sure, mending what was broken, making space for healing to begin. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the church's dusty windows as Preacher Wilkes delivered his sermon. Emmanuel sat in the back pew, while Kim helped lead the children's choir near the altar. The peaceful atmosphere shattered as the door burst open with a bang. Kim's father stumbled in, reeking of whiskey. "Where's that mountain man who thinks he can buy my daughter?" he bellowed, weaving down the aisle. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Kim's face flushed crimson as she ducked her head, shoulders trembling. Several mothers pulled their children closer. "You owe me!" Her father jabbed a dirty finger toward Emmanuel. "She's my flesh and blood, and you'll pay fair price to wed her." Emmanuel rose slowly, his worn boots scraping the wooden floor. The whole church held its breath as he stepped into the aisle, standing tall and steady. "Years ago," Emmanuel's clear voice carried to every corner, "I made a jest to a hungry child that I'd marry her when she grew up." He looked directly at Kim, whose eyes were now fixed on him. "Today, before God and this congregation, I make that jest a sacred vow. I'll wed Kim because I love her, not because I bought her. She's no man's property. She's a child of God and my chosen bride." Silence fell. Then Mrs. Peterson began nodding, followed by others. The preacher stepped down from his pulpit, a gentle smile crossing his weathered face. "Perhaps," Preacher Wilkes said quietly, "we should perform this wedding right now." Kim stepped forward on trembling legs, her simple calico dress rustling as she joined Emmanuel at the altar. The morning sunlight caught the single white ribbon in her dark hair. Her father's heavy boots stomped down the aisle and out the door, the bang of his exit echoing through the church. Preacher Wilkes opened his worn Bible, its pages glowing gold in the streaming light. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice warm and steady. One by one, The congregation rose to their feet. Even old Mrs. Peterson, who'd been quickest to gossip, stood with tears in her eyes. Emmanuel's rough hand engulfed Kim's smaller one as they spoke their vows, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Emmanuel bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Kim's lips. The church erupted in applause, joy replacing the tension of moments before. That evening, lamplight danced across the walls of the preacher's parlor as his wife served a simple wedding supper. The rich aroma of beef stew filled the room, accompanied by fresh-baked bread and apple pie. Emmanuel and Kim sat close together at the head of the table, their clasped hands resting between their plates, faces glowing with happiness. Outside on the porch, neighbors gathered to offer congratulations. The whispers that had once cut like knives now turned to murmurs of admiration. "Did you see how he stood up for her?" they said. "That's what I call true love." The morning sun painted golden stripes across the path as Emmanuel and Kim walked hand in hand towards their cabin. Fresh pine boards gleamed on the new addition Emmanuel had built, the scent of sawdust still lingering in the air. At the doorway, Emmanuel swept Kim into his arms, her woolen skirt swishing as he carried her across the threshold. Their shared laughter echoed in the small space. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harkins," Emmanuel said softly, setting her down in their kitchen. Days flowed together like a gentle stream. Kim hung curtains at the windows and planted herbs by the door. Emmanuel built shelves for her books and a special desk where she could grade papers. Each morning they shared coffee and scripture before Kim walked to the schoolhouse, her steps light with purpose. Word spread through town about the teacher who welcomed every child, and Kim's class grew. Children from the settlement families who had once turned away now sat alongside the poor and native students. Their eager voices carried across the schoolyard as Kim taught reading and numbers with patient grace. Emmanuel found himself spending more time working the land around their cabin, planting corn and beans in neat rows. Though he still checked his trap lines, he kept closer to home, cherishing the sight of lamplight in their window each evening. One stormy night, a knock came at their door. A fever-racked mother stood swaying, clutching her small son. "Please," she whispered before collapsing. Despite their best care, she didn't survive the night. The boy, Timothy, had nowhere else to go. "We'll keep him," Kim said simply, holding the sleeping child. Emmanuel nodded, remembering a cold night years ago when he'd found another child in need. They made up a bed in the new room, and Timothy became their son in heart, if not in blood. In the evenings, Emmanuel would often sit in his chair by the fire, watching Kim teach Timothy his letters or tell him stories. The lamplight through their window shone like a beacon across the valley, drawing in others seeking shelter and mercy. "You know," Emmanuel would say, his eyes twinkling as he pulled Kim close, "I once joked I'd marry the little beggar girl." He'd kiss her temple softly. Turns out God meant every word. Kim would smile, remembering that first meal he'd bought her so long ago. Their love had grown into something greater than themselves, a legacy of mercy, faith, and family that reached far beyond their cabin walls. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.